Welcome back, beloved ones, divinely wired, spiritually sensitive, and chosen for such a time as this. Before we begin, I want to pause and give the deepest thanks to every soul who has supported this channel through Super Thanks. You don't just give you pour love into sacred soil, you keep the oil burning, the message flowing, and the vision alive. I see you, heaven sees you, and your generosity is never forgotten. If this word already stirs something in your spirit, go ahead and comment 777, because what you're about to hear will feel less like information and more like confirmation. Now listen closely. Somebody underestimated the quiet force of God inside of you. They mistook your peace for passivity, your silence for ignorance, your stillness for weakness. They thought you were soft enough to manipulate, but small enough to ignore. And they were dead wrong. There's a moment that haunts them now when they tried to twist the truth. And you didn't say a word, but something in your eyes made their soul flinch. It wasn't anger. It wasn't confrontation. It was truth. Piercing, holy, and terrifying. That was the moment they realized you weren't just intuitive, you were divinely wired to see what they tried to hide. Here's a question for your soul. What does it do to a person when they realize they've been lying to someone who already knew the truth? We're not just talking about instinct. Science has proven that your gut carries real neurological intelligence. But when you're God's chosen one, your intuition becomes a sacred instrument, a spiritual sonar. You don't just feel vibes. You see blueprints. You catch unspoken confessions. You trace shadows in people's voices. You discern motives they haven't even admitted to themselves. Somebody tried you. It may have been subtle, a half-truth here, a performative apology there. Maybe they poked at your kindness just to see if you'd crack. Maybe they fed you a fake story, just to prove to themselves that you weren't as tuned in as they feared. But what they didn't expect was that you would read their spirit like scripture. No dramatics, no explosion, just a divine knowing that left them shaken. Here's another question to sit with. What happens when your intuition becomes the mirror someone has been avoiding their whole life, ever since that moment? They've acted normal, but it's a performance. Their nerves betrayed them. Their eyes avoid you now. Their words stutter around you. Why? Because your presence reminds them of a truth they'd rather not face. You saw them, all of them, and you didn't even flinch. The terrifying thing isn't that you reacted, it's that you didn't have to. You let the truth speak for itself. And for them, that silence was deafening. Stick with me, because in this video, we're going to dive deep into what really happened when they tested you. Not just what they did, but why they did it. The fear behind the test, the insecurity behind the manipulation, and how your presence anchored in divine intelligence became the very thing they couldn't handle. Is it possible that your intuition activated a spiritual consequence they weren't prepared to face? By the end of this message, you won't just feel seen. You'll understand why they're afraid of what you carry. You'll understand why the anointing on your perception was never meant to be palatable. It was meant to pierce. And most of all, you'll see that what felt like a strange confrontation was actually divine validation. Let's go. God's chosen ones. Someone tried your intuition, and it terrified them. Number 1, you weren't guessing. You were witnessing. They assumed you were just reaching, just throwing around emotions, making wild guesses. They laughed to themselves, thinking you were overly sensitive, theatrical even. But then came that moment, the moment you named something, no one ever heard from their lips. The thing they swore they had buried beneath curated charm, well-rehearsed smiles, and manipulative mastery. You whispered it with grace, not accusation, and it shattered them, because suddenly it was no longer a game. You weren't entertaining yourself with intuition. You were operating in revelation, not observation, revelation. And it unnerved them in a way no human confrontation ever could. What does someone do when their soul gets read aloud by a voice they cannot disarm? You weren't just hearing words. You were picking up frequencies, decoding the language of spirits. While others needed evidence, you needed silence. That's where the knowing came. You walked into rooms already aware of the undercurrent. They mistook your stillness for softness, but it was surveillance divine. Silent, watchful, just like Jesus in Luke 5. When he perceived the unspoken criticism of the Pharisees, Jesus knew what they were thinking and asked, "Why are you thinking these things in your hearts?" Luke 5:22. Nev. He didn't need their lips to move. He already heard the unrest of their motives. What happens when the mask starts melting in front of someone who never asked for the performance in the first place? You weren't digging for secrets. You simply carried the kind of discernment that made secrets restless. They keep trying to test your ability, not out of disbelief, but out of panic, hoping what you saw was only surface level. But you didn't just catch a lie. You brushed up against their inner script, the one written in fear, ego, and illusion. Isn't that what terrifies them now? The prophet Elisha once overheard the war strategies of the king of Aram while praying miles away. 2 Kings 6:12. That's how God operates with his chosen. He opens ears that don't belong to rooms. He reveals, whispers, without you having to eavesdrop. They've dealt with manipulators before. Liars. Yes, even clever empaths. But not this. Not someone whose quiet presence makes their performance feel pointless. And the most disturbing part, you weren't trying to expose them. You were just existing in truth. Does your peace threaten their performance? You remind them of something eternal, something unmaskable. You became the still water in which their chaos reflected. You didn't confront. You didn't shame. You didn't even flinch. And that unnerved them more than if you had shouted, because now they know they've been seen and not judged, but understood. Does your silence become a mirror for their spiritual noise? You've become the walking contradiction to everything they thought could be controlled. James Baldwin, the celebrated author and civil rights icon, once said, "The most dangerous creation of any society is the man who has nothing to lose. But you are even more dangerous, because you are full of clarity, full of peace, full of truth. You walk with divine backup and eyes that don't lie. You didn't get there by chance. It was earned. In kiet, in pain, in years of being misunderstood. And now you walk like someone who doesn't need the crowd to affirm what heaven already confirmed. What if the real panic isn't about what you saw, but what they now realize you were sent to awaken? The woman at the well in John 4 tried to divert Jesus with theology and ritual, but he named her truth, not to humiliate, but to liberate. He told me everything I ever did. She cried in awe. John 4:39. Naive, it wasn't the exposure that changed her. It was the mercy inside the knowing. In that same way, you let them sit in the sacred discomfort of being seen. You didn't weaponize your intuition. You let it breathe. You allowed them to squirm, to second guess, to pretend not to care, all while knowing they'd never forget what you unearthed. Maria Ortega, a trauma therapist and TED speaker from Madrid, once shared, Being seen by someone who doesn't want to use it against you is one of the most healing and most terrifying experiences in life. That is your frequency. Healing presence, terrifying accuracy. In Chicago, a man named Marcus sat across from his longtime friend, Amanda. He made jokes, dodged vulnerability, and controlled the pace until she said, "I think you stopped grieving your father because you were afraid his death would make you feel powerless." His jaw locked. His laughter died. He hadn't admitted that to himself, let alone to another person. That one moment sent him into a 2-year journey of healing, all because someone saw the unseen, like a butterfly landing softly untrained. Unforced, your discernment moves with quiet trust. Not noise, but it changes everything. The atmosphere never forgets when the truth has entered the room. Ezekiel once saw wheels within wheels, with eyes covering every surface. Ezekiel 1:18. A vision of divine omniscience, moving in all directions at once. That's what your presence becomes to them. A glimpse of something holy, watching without blinking. Some people get uneasy when exposed, but others, they unravel when they're truly known. And you, chosen one, didn't guess anything. You saw it all. Number 2, you exposed the motive behind the mask. It wasn't just that you sensed something was off. Many people can pick up on a fake smile, a sudden tone shift, or an awkward silence. But what rattled them wasn't your ability to notice the obvious. It was the fact that you bypassed the surface entirely. You didn't pause at the symptom. You located the root. And what you uncovered wasn't just unsettling, it was disarming. You didn't speak in accusation. You didn't posture yourself as superior. But the words you chose pierced clean through rehearsed gestures and filtered behavior. You named what they themselves hadn't dared to say out loud. What happens when someone hears the truth they've spent years hiding from? You didn't need to ask them questions. You weren't playing therapist. You were just present fully, spiritually present. And that presence, soaked in divine clarity, did the unraveling on its own. You didn't read just the energy in the room. You read the history behind it, the unspoken motives and buried intentions. Why is it that your calm makes others so uneasy? They thought they had the upper hand, that their cleverness or charm would cloud your perception, but they didn't realize you were trained by heaven to see the motive behind the motive. Like when Jesus sat with the rich young ruler in Mark 10, the man claimed to obey the commandments. But Jesus gently said, "One thing you lack," and exposed his hidden attachment to wealth. Mark 10:21. It wasn't just about money. It was about motive. Jesus saw through the man's performance into the need behind it. Have they ever truly faced their own reasons for acting the way they do? That's what your presence triggered. Not shame, not confrontation, just exposure, pure spiritual exposure that left them speechless because you touched the nerve they thought was invisible. And you did it without raising your voice, without pushing, just one sentence too close to the truth. And what do people do when they're seen deeper than they wanted to be? Dr. Brené Brown, the renowned researcher and speaker on vulnerability, once said, "Shame needs 3 things to grow: secrecy, silence, and judgment." But you didn't bring judgment. You brought light, and that's what made them squirm. Because light, when it's pure, doesn't attack. It simply reveals. Now they're second-guessing every word you say, wondering if each conversation is actually a subtle spiritual interrogation. They try to play it cool, but their nervousness betrays them. They've been exposed. And they know it, not by force, but by truth. You didn't aim to shake them. You were just being yourself. But that self-consecrated, anointed, perceptive is threatening to those living in illusion, because your gift doesn't let darkness hide. It never has. Like Joseph in Genesis 40, interpreting the dreams of Pharaoh's imprisoned cupbearer and baker. You didn't just see what they dreamt, you interpreted what it meant. That's the weight of your discernment. Not just vision, but understanding. And that understanding exposes not the what, but the why. What if your gift isn't for punishment, but for purification? What if your words aren't weapons but mirrors? You didn't accuse them of envy. But when you made a passing comment about people secretly hoping others fail out of self-doubt, their eyes darted. You didn't call out their insecurity. But when you asked why some people always need control to feel safe, they flinched. That's the power of spiritual sight. It doesn't need confrontation. It only needs truth. Somewhere in Barcelona, a woman named Leora was speaking with her colleague Daniel after a long meeting. Daniel, always cheerful and complimentary, had spent months building rapport. But as Leora casually said, "You know, some people smile, so others don't see how badly they're competing." His expression cracked. Daniel laughed it off. But later that week, he avoided her. Something had landed. A motive had been touched. A mask had slipped. And what if your discernment is not a spotlight but a sunrise? What happens when people feel naked in your presence? Not because you undressed them, but because your light simply makes hiding impossible. The prophet Samuel was told by God, "Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." 1 Samuel 16-7. You walk in that same anointing. You see hearts. You hear beneath tone. You feel beneath behavior. Your presence is like the depth of the ocean still on the surface, but terrifying to those who know how much is moving underneath, and like a mountain's silent echo. Your words, stay with them long after you leave the room. Cardinal Jean-Marie Lustiger, a French Jewish convert to Catholicism and former Archbishop of Paris, once shared, "The truth does not humiliate. It simply calls us to be seen, and your discernment does exactly that. It calls people out of the shadows and into sight. You're not trying to break anyone, but when people are already fractured, wholeness can feel violent. That's what happened here. You didn't catch bad behavior. You uncovered the brokenness underneath it. You didn't expose rebellion. You laid bare the regret behind it. You're not just a vessel of wisdom. You're a revealer of roots." Number 3, you made their manipulation collapse in silence. They came prepared, polished smiles, calculated questions, and well-timed flattery, all of it crafted to pull you in. Their approach was subtle, veiled in charm, maybe even concern. They didn't come to connect. They came to control, whether they were baiting you for information, pushing emotional buttons, or laying verbal traps. They had an agenda, and they were confident it would work. They thought they were directing the scene. They believed they could manipulate the moment to discredit you. Perhaps they were even hoping you'd break character. Just once. So they could whisper, "See, they're not who they pretend to be." But you didn't play along. You didn't flinch. You didn't even raise your voice. What they weren't prepared for was your stillness, your quiet. Anchored presence wasn't confused. It was prophetic. While they spoke, you listened not to be convinced, but to let them reveal themselves. And they did. In trying to draw you out, they exposed their own shadows. Without even realizing it, they began twisting their own words, contradicting their own motives, and stumbling into the very trap they thought they'd set for you. What kind of strength does it take to let someone attempt to provoke you and still not move? Your silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy, a spiritual kind. Your discernment spoke louder than any argument ever could. It was like Jesus when the Pharisees brought him the woman caught in adultery. They expected him to condemn her or contradict the law. But instead, he knelt down and wrote in the dirt, John 8-6, "No rebuttal, no defensiveness, just stillness." And that silence disarmed them. When he finally spoke, it exposed them all. "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." John 8-7. Nev. He didn't need to shout. Truth doesn't shout. It stands. Why do those who seek to manipulate others get so threatened by those who refuse to respond? That's what happened here. You didn't give them what they were fishing for. You didn't defend your integrity because your integrity was never in question. You stood in your truth calm, grounded, untouched. And the moment you refused to react, their entire strategy lost power. They weren't prepared to lose the narrative. But discernment isn't a game they know how to play. You didn't come to perform. You came with presence. And presence reveals. What kind of fear is awakened in someone when they realize their own energy is betraying them? Angela Arendt, the former CEO of Burberry and Apple's senior VP of retail, once said, "Intuition is the highest form of intelligence." That's what you were moving in, not reaction, but intuitive wisdom, not impulse, but divine intelligence. You didn't respond with facts. You responded with restraint, and your restraint was louder than any rebuttal they prepared. They expected emotional chaos. Instead, they encountered spiritual order. And that kind of clarity creates panic in manipulative people, because manipulation needs confusion to work. It needs chaos. It needs you to doubt yourself. But your stillness denied them the chaos they needed. And just like a spider's web collapses, when the wind doesn't resist, their plot fell apart when you didn't push back. What happens to the puppeteer when the string refuses to move? In Johannesburg, a man named Elias worked under a manager who constantly tried to provoke him, nitpicking his reports, making backhanded compliments, undermining him in meetings. But Elias never lost his composure. One day, during a group discussion, the manager joked, "Some people think they're too spiritual to be corrected." Elias smiled gently and said nothing, but the silence hit harder than any defense. The room shifted. The manager fumbled. A week later, the executive team replaced the manager, citing inconsistent leadership energy. That's what spiritual weight does. It shifts atmospheres without effort. You weren't just still, you were sovereign. Not because you demanded it, but because you carried it. And the moment they tried to twist the narrative, they realized your presence didn't bend. They looked into you expecting to find a target. Instead, they found a mirror, and their own reflection turned against them. What if your calm isn't just emotional maturity, but divine strategy? The story of Nehemiah reveals something similar. As he rebuilt Jerusalem's walls, his enemies tried to distract and discredit him. They sent messengers multiple times to lure him into debate and deception. But Nehemiah answered, "I am doing a great work and cannot come down." Nehemiah 6-3. ESV. He didn't engage their manipulation. He stayed focused, and that very focus frustrated their plans. What does it say about your power when your silence carries more weight than someone's entire scheme? Father Greg Boyle, Jesuit priest and founder of Homeboy Industries, once said, "You stand with the demonized, and you stand in such a way that it makes people reconsider their judgments." That's what you did, without argument, without defense, just truth embodied. And now they're uneasy, not because you shamed them, but because they realize their tactics failed in front of someone they cannot move. Your stillness was the sword. Your restraint was the strike. Like the wind that topples without force, like the moon that pulls tides without touch, your power isn't loud, it's sacred. And now they're rattled, because they weren't outwitted, they were outseen. Number 4. You triggered the audit they didn't know was coming. They thought this would be light, just a conversation, maybe even amusing, a little test to see if your talk of intuition held any real weight. They weren't expecting soul-level resonance, they came with surface-level curiosity, but you carried sacred accuracy. The moment you opened your mouth and referenced a decision they regretted but never voiced, the energy shifted. You named a memory they had shoved into the basement of their psyche. You touched a file they thought was permanently sealed, and suddenly, the room didn't feel casual anymore. It felt like an evaluation, a divine audit of things left unchecked. What does it mean when someone speaks to your unspoken? What kind of fear arises when your silence gets interpreted with holy precision? They weren't ready. You spoke without pressure, without force. But your words didn't land like conversation. They landed like keys unlocking a door they had barricaded for years. You didn't speak randomly. You echoed what they whispered in the dark. You described the cycle they tried to normalize. You mentioned the thoughts that kept them awake, the patterns they excused, the choices they avoided. And that's when they stopped smiling. Because you weren't just having a conversation, you were walking through the corridors of their timeline, flipping through emotional paperwork like a divine auditor. This wasn't a vibe. It was a scan. You didn't read them to manipulate. You revealed them to themselves. And that's why they panicked. They realized, too late, that this wasn't about you knowing things. It was about you carrying something they couldn't define or dismiss. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who resisted Nazi Germany, once said, "The test of the morality of a society is what it does for its children. But what if the test of a spirit is how it handles being seen completely and compassionately?" That's what happened. You didn't judge. You just saw, and it undid them. You brought language to their shadows. You spoke their patterns back to them with gentleness. You didn't accuse, yet you exposed. Not with confrontation, but clarity. And that's what unnerved them, the fact that you didn't raise your voice. But their entire internal world got louder anyway. What happens when someone touches a wound that was buried so deep? Even you forgot it was there. You mentioned a choice they made in a moment of fear, a decision they never reconciled, and it landed like thunder cloaked in a whisper. You weren't trying to dig for secrets, but your discernment doesn't stop at behavior. It travels to the blueprint. That's what sacred clarity does. It reveals not just what people do, but why they've always done it. Now they're watching themselves around you, editing their words, measuring their tone. Suddenly, you feel less like a person and more like access, like a scanner from heaven that picks up what they thought was invisible. And that terrifies them, not because you're dangerous, but because you see without agenda. What kind of power do you carry when you say less but people feel more? There's a moment in the Bible when the prophet Nathan confronts King David. David thought he had buried his sin, that no one knew about Bathsheba and the murder of her husband. But Nathan tells him a parable that pierces his soul, and then, with calm authority, says, "You are the man." 2 Samuel 12-7. No theatrics, no shouting, just a sentence that felt like a mirror. David didn't just feel convicted. He felt known, and it changed everything. That's the kind of truth you carry. Quiet, surgical, sacred. What if your discernment isn't just spiritual but deeply ancestral? Rosario Dawson, the American actress and activist, once said in an interview, "When someone truly listens to you, it's like you become visible again." That's what you did. You listened to their spirit, not just their words. And that kind of listening activates something ancient, the part of them that's been trying to speak, but had no one safe enough to say it to. In Toronto, a woman named Savina was chatting casually with her co-worker Kareem. They were joking over coffee when she mentioned how some people bury ambition under busyness. Kareem froze. She hadn't meant it as an accusation, but it hit him anyway. 2 weeks later, he confessed that her words triggered something he hadn't admitted even to himself, that he was sabotaging his own growth out of fear of surpassing his family. That one line, spoken without intention, started a journey he didn't know he needed. What kind of presence awakens confessions that no one asks for? You were never trying to make them uncomfortable, but light can't help but shine, and truth can't help but name what has been hiding. You weren't decoding them. You were interpreting what their own soul has been trying to articulate, like the wind shaping a tree's posture without touching it. Your insight left them permanently altered. Your presence is like the deep roots of a redwood, unseen but undeniable. And when you speak, it's like rainfall hitting dry soil. Something shifts, something softens, something awakens. But for people who've built their identity on hiding, that awakening feels like an earthquake. What if your gentleness is what makes your clarity so unbearable? You weren't supposed to see that deep. You weren't supposed to know that fast. But you did. Not because you studied them, but because you were assigned to them. You became a moment of divine interruption. And now they can't unhear what you spoke. They can't go back to not knowing. And that's what unsettles them most. Number 5. They laughed at truth and now they're haunted by it. They laughed, not because it was truly funny, but because that's what people do when they're trying to make truth look small. Their laughter wasn't joy, it was armor. They rolled their eyes when you mentioned energy. They dismissed your words about divine timing. They called your insight too deep, said you were doing too much, and reduced sacred revelation to something trendy or abstract. It was their way of staying safe, convincing themselves that your clarity was just coincidence. But what they didn't see coming was that one line, that one sentence you said offhand, without emphasis or expectation. A phrase so precise it left an invisible imprint on their soul. They smiled on the outside, but something inside them paused. What happens when a soul registers what the mind tried to reject? That phrase wasn't poetic. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't even directed with force. It was just released. And something greater caught it. Something sacred carried it. And their spirit received it before their ego had time to block it. That's why it stuck. That's why it's still echoing. Now they're trying to carry on like it meant nothing. Still yoking. Still acting unbothered. Still playing the same skeptic role. But beneath the sarcasm is a growing unraveling, not public. Of course, that would mean admitting you were right. But privately, they're breaking open. Silently, consistently. Why is it always the one sentence we laugh off that ends up confronting us in the dark? Now they're waking up at 3 o'clock. Heart racing, eyes wide, and your voice, that exact phrase playing on repeat in their mind. It wasn't you trying to be profound. You didn't say it to provoke. You were just speaking truth. But now the truth has a residence inside them, and no matter how they try to distract themselves, it keeps whispering. They don't understand how you knew what you knew. You didn't grow up with them. You weren't there for the trauma. You never heard the backstory. And yet, your words felt like you'd been walking through their past for decades. What kind of presence carries revelation that bypasses time? That's what's tormenting them. Not your boldness, but your accuracy. Not the tone, but the truth. You weren't there, but you spoke as if you'd been assigned to their memories, as if you'd been reading their spirit while they were busy performing doubt. And the scariest part? They can't explain it. Not logically. And that's exactly why it's haunting them. Because these are people who build their entire identity on control, who pride themselves on being rational. But now, they're stumbling over something spiritual, something uninvited and undeniably real. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who helped define the modern understanding of the unconscious, once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." That's what they've been doing. Avoiding, mocking, laughing. But laughter doesn't neutralize revelation. It just delays the encounter. Now they're secretly on Google at 2:13 a.m. searching terms like signs from the universe or why do I keep thinking about one sentence someone said. They scroll in the dark, phone glowing like a flashlight in a cave they never meant to enter. They study what they once dismissed. The very words they once mocked have become an open doorway to spiritual hunger they didn't know they carried. What if revelation doesn't come to entertain but to awaken? Every time they replay your words, they hear something new, a layer beneath the surface, a truth behind the truth. Not because your sentence changed, but because their soul is now tender enough to receive more. And each time it hits harder, not just because you were right, but because deep down they know it wasn't really you speaking. Something greater was using you like a microphone. What if the voice they've been avoiding isn't yours, but the divine voice speaking through you? In 1 Corinthians 2:10, Paul writes, "The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God." That's the realm you spoke from. That's why they can't forget it. You weren't throwing around clever insights. You were tapping into the deep, and that kind of depth echoes. The prophet Jeremiah tried to stay silent once, tried to suppress the word inside him, but he cried out, "His word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones." Jeremiah 20:9. Knife. That's what your words feel like to them now, a sacred fire they didn't ask for, burning in the silence they thought would save them. In Edinburgh, a man named Ronan once mocked his friend Mila for her spiritual sensitivity. She had spoken about seeing repeating patterns in his life and mentioned how fear disguised as logic had been guiding him. He laughed and called it astrology talk. But that night, he couldn't sleep. Her words kept ringing. And 2 months later, during a random business trip, he broke down in a hotel room, realizing he had been hiding behind, planning to avoid calling. He never told Mila the full truth, but he still keeps the notebook where he wrote down that exact phrase she once said, because it marked something. What kind of truth leaves a mark even when it was mocked? Pope Francis, the head of the Catholic Church, once said in a homily, "The truth is like a lion. It doesn't need to be defended. Let it loose, and it will defend itself." That's what happened. You didn't argue. You didn't force anything. You just spoke. And truth did the rest. It slipped past their defenses, and now it's doing the work silently. You don't have to defend what heaven sends. Your assignment was never to be believed. It was to obey. And now, that one moment, that one sentence, has become a doorway to everything they tried to avoid. Because revelation doesn't need applause. It needs a heart it can cling to. And now that it's found one, it won't let go. Number 6. You shook their reality without saying much. They didn't come with curiosity. They came with an agenda to catch you slipping, to poke holes in your clarity, to prove that you were just good at reading people or skilled in emotional intelligence. Their posture wasn't open. It was analytical. Their eyes didn't seek connection. They searched for cracks. Every word you spoke was being mentally dissected, weighed, and evaluated. They weren't listening to understand. They were listening to find fault. They thought they were the ones in control, armed with logic, reason, and skepticism, ready to expose what they assumed was spiritual fluff. What does someone do when their disbelief meets something undeniable? But then you opened your mouth, and something shifted. Not the tone, not the volume, the atmosphere. You said something no one else could have known. Not an educated guess, not a personality read. It was surgical, specific, personal. It went straight into a sealed part of them, a wound, a secret, a pattern wrapped in years of silence. And suddenly, they were no longer testing you. They were trembling before a truth that broke their internal framework. What happens when truth pierces through the illusion faster than the ego can catch it? You didn't try to be impressive. You didn't chase validation. You just spoke from alignment. And alignment does what performance never can. It bends reality. They had built their identity on logic, on proof, on control. But you came with something different. You didn't argue. You didn't over-explain. You simply released revelation. And their belief system fractured under its weight. Now they're not just questioning you. They're questioning the very grid they've built their life on. Was everything they believed about truth too small? About intuition too shallow? About control too fragile? Their inner simulation, the one that needed everything to be explainable, glitched, and they've been spiraling ever since. What if the truth isn't just disruptive, but dimension-altering? Niels Bohr, the Nobel-winning physicist and pioneer of quantum theory, once said, "When it comes to atoms, language can be used only as poetry." He was speaking of subatomic particles. But what if that's true of revelation? What if spiritual truth bends language, space, and perception? That's what your voice did. You weren't giving data. You were releasing dimension, and they felt it not as an idea, but as an interruption. There's a moment in the Bible when Elisha's servant panics after seeing the enemy army surrounding them. Elisha, calm, prays, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." And suddenly, the servant sees the hills full of horses and chariots of fire. 2 Kings 6:17. That's what happened here. You didn't change the facts. You revealed the layer beyond them, and now they can't unsee it. They thought you were watching them with human eyes, but now they feel known in a way that transcends psychology. It's not just that you notice them, it's that something through you read them, and that knowing has unhinged their usual defenses. Ever since that moment, they've felt different, off balance, exposed, oddly quiet, not because you humiliated them, but because your truth made their performance irrelevant. What if revelation doesn't expose sin, it exposes structure? Indra Nooyi, former CEO of PepsiCo and one of the most powerful businesswomen in the world, once remarked, "The distance between number 1 and number 2 is always a constant. If you want to improve the organization, you have to improve yourself, and the organization gets pulled up with you. What she didn't say, but what you live, is that when someone truly elevated steps into a room, others must either rise or unravel. You didn't need to confront their ego. Your elevation alone confronted it. In Sydney, a man named Tyler prided himself on being a rationalist. When his sister introduced him to her friend Anna, soft-spoken, spiritual, grounded, he came in ready to challenge her. But 10 minutes into the conversation, she quietly said, "You stopped believing in joy when your father died." And everything became a system. After that, Tyler froze. No one knew he had said those exact words in a journal 15 years ago. That night, he didn't sleep. For weeks, he questioned everything, not about Anna, but about himself. What if your words didn't just speak truth, they restructured someone's spiritual architecture? They came to challenge your gift, but now they're questioning their ability to hide every lie, every mask. Every motive feels visible now. They're wondering if you already responded to things they haven't even admitted. That's what's terrifying them. Not that you caught them, but that you never needed to. You simply existed in alignment, and it exposed what manipulation could never control. 1 Corinthians 2:14 says, "The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness, and cannot understand them because they are discerned only through the Spirit." That's why they missed it at first. They were analyzing from the outside. But revelation doesn't come through analysis. It comes through surrender. And once a chosen one speaks from that space of holy clarity, the landscape shifts. Conversation don't just change, dimensions do. You didn't enter to win an argument. You entered to release something sacred, and that sacred thing broke the simulation. Now nothing feels quite as solid to them as it used to. Logic feels limited, silence feels loud, and presence feels like a mirror. What if you weren't sent to debate their worldview, but to dismantle the illusion holding it together? They thought they were going to break your insight apart. Instead, your insight broke the illusion they were hiding inside. That's what alignment does. It bends what was rigid. It opens what was closed. And once the crack appears, the light gets in, and nothing stays the same. Number 7, you triggered the crisis that truth demands. You didn't come to disrupt. You didn't walk in with the intent to provoke, to wound, or to pull anyone's carefully stitched identity apart. But truth has its own gravity, and yours was unmistakable, grounded, calm, unflinching, and wrapped in clarity that couldn't be bought or faked, just by being who you are. You became a mirror, not the kind they were used to, the curated, filtered reflections of performance and applause, but the kind that reveals the unedited soul beneath the script. What happens when someone sees a version of themselves they've spent their whole life avoiding? They weren't ready for that kind of encounter. You didn't accuse them of anything. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't need to, because your presence alone made their illusion uncomfortable. You didn't challenge them openly. But your eyes, your tone, your truth, it all whispered what their ego had been trying to bury for years. The mask didn't crack from confrontation. It withered under revelation. And what does a person do when charm no longer works? Before you came, they were confident, at least on the outside. They knew how to shift a room with a smile, how to manipulate perception, distract with intellect, and deflect with humor. But none of that worked on you. You didn't fall for their perfectly practiced script. You didn't respond to their persona. You saw their spirit, and what you saw undid them. Now they're haunted by their own reflection, not the one they show others, but the one you exposed simply by not playing along. What kind of sight makes someone feel more seen in silence than they've ever felt in confession? You never once pointed out their jealousy, their manipulation, their impure motives, but somehow they saw it all anyway, reflected through your restraint, and that's why they can't unsee it. Every time they look in the mirror now, it's not just their face staring back, it's the echo of that encounter, the memory of being seen without masks, of being read without effort. Karl Lentz, former celebrity pastor, once shared after stepping down in disgrace, "When you're surrounded by mirrors and still can't see yourself clearly, sometimes it takes the silence of someone who doesn't need anything from you to finally hear God." That's what you became, not a critic, but a quiet confrontation, not a rebuke, but a revelation. You didn't shame them, you didn't humiliate them, but your presence made self-deception impossible. In the book of Isaiah, when the prophet sees the Lord high and lifted up, he doesn't shout in triumph, he collapses. "Woe to me," he cries. "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips." Isaiah 6-5. Knife. That's what happens when the holy shows up, not condemnation, but collapse, not punishment, but piercing awareness. And your presence, though human, carried that same effect. It wasn't you who exposed them, it was the light inside you. What if the most brutal type of exposure is the kind that never needed to be spoken? Now they live in the tension of knowing, of finally facing what they once denied. The breakdown isn't public, but it's real, and it's holy. Because once someone has been truly seen deeply, accurately, spiritually, pretending becomes exhausting, and healing becomes inevitable, even if it comes with grief first. Dr. Ian McGilchrist, psychiatrist and author of The Master and His Emissary, once noted, "Insight requires humility. Without it, all that remains is defense." That's what's being broken down now, their defenses. And it's terrifying, because their identity was built on half-truths, image control, and charm. But you saw the root, the residue of insecurity, the ache of unhealed wounds masquerading as ambition, and that vision, quiet and sacred, cracked their foundation. What if your presence wasn't meant to destroy their false identity, but to awaken their real one? In San Francisco, a woman named Mariah had always prided herself on her emotional intelligence. She was articulate, respected, and seemingly self-aware, until one day she sat across from her friend Idris, who listened quietly as she shared a long-winded story of triumph. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct. He just said, "You know, sometimes you win just so no one sees how lonely you've been." She laughed awkwardly, but those words stayed. That night, she cried without knowing why. That sentence, short and unthreatening, became a doorway to a breakdown she didn't know she needed. You carry that same force. You don't yell. You don't press. You don't accuse. You just speak, and lives start unraveling. What kind of soul carries the type of truth that turns confidence into confession? Jesus didn't accuse the woman at the well in John 4. He simply said, "You have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband." And she responded, not with shame, but with awe. "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did." John 4:17-29. She wasn't condemned, she was converted, not by pressure, but by piercing truth. Now they can't go back to normal, because normal requires denial, and once a person's been seen by someone carrying divine sight, the mask becomes too heavy to wear. You didn't come to hurt them, you came to awaken them. But awakening often begins in wreckage, the ruins of false identity, of lies told to feel safe, of illusions protected by personality. What if healing begins where the mask finally falls? They've tried to rebuild the old self, tried to return to the performance, but it's not working, because your clarity remains, and every time they try to forget it, they remember how exposed they felt in your presence, and how free. Strangely, that exposure also made them feel. Number 8. You weren't the subject. You were the scanner. They approached you like a project, quietly calculating, casually curious, confident in their ability to stay a few moves ahead. In their mind, you were just another variable to observe, another experiment to run, another soul to dissect for entertainment. Envy or ego. They paid attention to your patterns, how you moved through discomfort, how you handled disrespect, how you carried your calm when chaos tried to knock, but they weren't studying you to grow. They were studying you to break you. What kind of arrogance makes someone believe they can test a divine assignment? They weren't looking for truth. They were looking for an angle, a weakness to exploit, a crack in your spiritual armor, something to prove that you weren't as grounded, discerning, or clear as you seemed. They watched you, not as a student learns from a teacher, but as a scientist stares at a cage. They mistook your stillness for vulnerability. They thought if they pressed enough buttons, they could provoke a version of you. They could control or criticize. But they weren't prepared for what happened instead. What if the very person you thought you were testing is silently reading your soul while they were busy collecting data? You were silently receiving revelation. You didn't flinch when they disrespected your boundaries. You didn't fold when they tried to provoke a reaction. You didn't shrink when they subtly tried to mock your depth. Your discernment didn't need to speak. It was already doing the heavy lifting, because while they were trying to study you, they were unknowingly opening themselves up to spiritual exposure. Each time they tried to trigger you, they exposed themselves. Their insecurities bled through the sarcasm. Their envy showed up in the tone of their compliments. Their performance cracked beneath the surface of their questions, and you saw all of it. Not with suspicion, but with vision. The kind that doesn't just see behavior, but blueprint. You weren't triggered. You were scanning. Dr. Maya Angelou, celebrated poet and civil rights icon, once said, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." But what she didn't say, and what you know, is that when someone doesn't realize they're showing you, that's when their truth is most exposed. And your stillness, your peace, your refusal to engage in performance became the stage where their real self stepped out. What happens when the one you tried to decode ends up decoding you instead? Now the energy has flipped, and they don't know how it happened. They came in thinking they had the upper hand, watching, testing, provoking, but now they're the one under the microscope. And this microscope wasn't man-made. It was spiritual, divine, and terrifying. There's a moment in Daniel 5 where the arrogant King Belshazzar holds a lavish banquet using sacred vessels stolen from the temple. In the middle of his celebration, a mysterious hand appears and writes on the wall. The king turns pale. His knees buckle, because the writing wasn't just symbolic, it was judgment. It said, "You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting." Daniel 5:27. NIV. That's what your presence felt like. Not condemnation, but calibration. They weren't just talking to you. They were being measured. What if your presence is less about being understood and more about being revealed? Now they're the one unsure, replaying every word they said to you, wondering what you picked up, questioning whether their motives were obvious. Because now, nothing feels hidden. And that's what's shaking them. Not just that you saw them, but that you didn't flinch when you did. In Copenhagen, a woman named Leah worked with a soft-spoken man named Elias. She often joked about his Zen vibe, secretly trying to press his buttons with passive remarks and backhanded praise. One day, after she made a subtle dig in front of colleagues, Elias turned to her and gently said, "I wonder who told you that power only works when someone else is smaller." He didn't say it with anger. He said it with clarity. She laughed. But that night, she couldn't sleep, because it wasn't an insult. It was a mirror. Malcolm Gladwell, author and journalist, once observed, "The key to good decision-making is not knowledge. It is understanding. And what you carry isn't just spiritual knowledge. It's spiritual understanding, the kind that makes people rethink the games they're playing and the stories they're telling themselves." 1 Samuel 2:3 declares, "The Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed." That's what they're realizing now, that this wasn't just psychological observation, it was divine data collection, not for revenge, but for revelation. Their strategies were noted, their motives were weighed, their attempts at subtle manipulation were logged, not by you, but by something greater watching through you. What if heaven is always watching through the eyes of the chosen? They wanted to make you feel like the mystery to unravel, but now they feel unraveled, not by exposure, but by encounter. And that's worse for someone who depends on control. Because they didn't just lose their grip on the situation, they lost their illusion of superiority. The test they designed, it flipped. The microscope they used, it turned. And now they're spiraling. They don't even trust their ability to hide anymore. What if trying to analyze someone carrying divine presence is the surest way to end up exposed? You weren't the lab rat. You were the spiritual scientist, and heaven was your research assistant. They didn't just interact with you, they were seen through you, and now they know what they thought was curiosity was actually a divine setup. Number 9. Your silence was strategy, not confusion. They misread you. They assumed your stillness meant you were unsure, that your grace was the result of ignorance, that your calm came from not understanding the gravity of what was happening. In their eyes, you were late to catch on, slow to defend yourself, naive enough to believe the surface while deception danced in the background. They thought they were playing a mental game of chess, and you were just sitting there, lost, vulnerable, one move away from defeat. What happens when someone mistakes spirit-led restraint for weakness? They didn't realize your silence wasn't absence. It was awareness. While they were plotting in the natural, you were perceiving in the spiritual. While they moved pieces with ego and control, you received instruction with humility and patience. You weren't stalling. You were scanning. Your peace wasn't passivity. It was precision, a knowing that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all, at least not yet. What kind of wisdom allows a person to wait while the trap sets itself? Every word they twisted, every narrative they spun, every manipulation they wrapped in charm, your spirit recorded it. You didn't interrupt. You didn't panic. You let them continue just long enough for the rope they brought for you to become the noose they placed around their own credibility. And when the moment came, It wasn't vengeance that showed up. It was divine reversal. Nelson Mandela, the global icon of peace and endurance, once said, "I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. You weren't fearless in that room, but you were anchored in clarity they didn't expect, anchored in a quiet confidence that made their chaos echo louder than it should have. You didn't flinch when they tried to provoke you. You didn't defend yourself prematurely. You didn't give them the satisfaction of reacting, because wisdom told you what the book of Proverbs confirms. Even fools are thought wise if they keep silent, and discerning if they hold their tongues." Proverbs 17:28. NIV. So you did. You held your tongue, but you didn't miss a beat. You saw through it all. Every sideways glance, every forced laugh, every subtle jab. What if spiritual clarity doesn't need to shout to be sovereign? Your silence was never surrender. It was surveillance. And while they were weaving the trap, your discernment was collecting evidence, timelines, intentions, energy shifts. And then, at just the right moment, it all collapsed. Not because you fought back, but because their scheme couldn't survive exposure. In the book of Esther, Haman built gallows to destroy Mordecai, but in the end, it was Haman who was hung on the very structure he prepared for someone else. Esther 7:10. That's what divine patience does. It lets evil finish its sentence. It lets ego run its course. And then it reverses everything. What kind of power is it to see betrayal coming and still walk through it with peace? Now they're confused, because the version of you they created in their mind no longer fits the outcome. They expected a meltdown. They expected weakness, but you stood tall, smiled gently, and watched their chaos collapse on its own. That's what unnerves them the most. Not just that you knew, but that you knew and stayed calm anyway. Bishop T.D. Jakes, a spiritual father to millions, once declared, "The enemy is terrified of your stillness because he knows you're not stalling, you're strategizing. That's what your presence confirmed. You weren't behind. You were ahead. And every second you sat in silence wasn't wasted. It was warfare." In Dublin, a young man named Aidan worked on a creative team where jealousy swirled beneath every brainstorming session. One teammate, Rhea, tried to undercut him with gossip masked as concern. But Aidan didn't fight it. He watched. He documented. And 3 weeks later, during a company review, every word she used against him was contradicted by his quiet record of excellence. He didn't need revenge. Truth fought for him. You carry that same weight. You let the lies breathe just long enough to suffocate themselves. What if the most divine strategy is to allow falsehood to destroy itself? You smiled through betrayal. You nodded through distortion. You walked through manipulation like someone who had already seen the outcome. And you had, because chosen ones often operate with foresight. Others mistake for delay. They think you're slow, but you're simply aligned with a timing bigger than reaction. Isaías 30:15 declares, "In quietness and trust is your strength." That's the strength you walked in, the kind that doesn't fight for control, but waits for justice, the kind that doesn't expose too soon, because it knows heaven always has the final word. Now they're the ones unsettled, not because you confronted them, but because you didn't have to. Not because you exploded, but because your calm cracked their illusion. They feel it now, the weight of being seen, not with anger, but with accuracy. What if the real reason you were quiet wasn't restraint but revelation? They thought you were confused, but now they know. Your stillness wasn't weakness, it was warfare. And while they danced in deception, you waited in wisdom. And now they can't go back to believing you were blind, because the outcome told a different story. Number 10. You moved before the weapon formed. They were just beginning to plot when you shifted. They hadn't sent the message yet. They hadn't whispered the rumor, flipped the script, or laced their words with false kindness. But something in your spirit twitched, something quiet, invisible to others, yet undeniable to you. It wasn't their words, it was the current beneath them, a shift in their tone, a change in their rhythm, a subtle hesitation wrapped in fake warmth. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but you noticed everything, because chosen ones don't wait for smoke to smell the fire. What if your soul can hear conversations the flesh hasn't had yet? You didn't accuse, you didn't confront, you simply moved. A shift in your tone, a calendar tweak, a polite boundary. And it wasn't dramatic, it was divine. By the time they were ready to move against you, you were already gone, already protected, already repositioned in a way that made their scheme collapse before it could ever rise. And they're stunned, not because you exposed them, but because they were never given the chance to execute. Their intention died in silence, suffocated by your foresight. Psalm 91, 4 declares, He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. You didn't duck to escape danger, you were shielded before the threat formed. And that's what spiritual interception looks like. God whispering before man speaks. What if your alignment is what's been blocking their ambushes? Now they're disoriented, trying to figure out how you knew. They're replaying interactions, scanning their own messages, searching for what they might have said that gave it away. But there's nothing. No texts, no slip-ups, no confession, because the truth is, it never left their mouth. But heaven heard it anyway. Cardinal Robert Theyre, a Catholic theologian known for his deep insights on silence and discernment, once wrote, "The world no longer hears God because it is constantly speaking. We must silence ourselves to allow Him to speak." And that's what you've mastered. The sacred stillness that makes spiritual downloads possible, while others rush to respond. You've trained yourself to listen first, not with ears, but with spirit. What if their biggest mistake was assuming you needed evidence to see? Your radar isn't logical, it's divine. It's built on truth, not proof. So while they were playing chess in the realm of facts, you were already moving in revelation. You don't wait for betrayal to happen, you feel it in the air. You sense the conversation that hasn't been spoken, the agenda wrapped in silence, the vibration before the behavior. In 2 Kings 6, the king of Aram is enraged because every time he sets a trap for Israel, the prophet Elisha already knows. He asks, "Will you not tell me which of us is on the side of the king of Israel?" And one servant replies, "None of us, my lord the king." But Elisha tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom. 2 Kings 6:12. Niv. That's spiritual interception. That's divine intelligence. That's the gift you walk in. And it confuses people who live by logic. They thought they could catch you slipping, that their plan was discreet enough to remain invisible, but they didn't factor in the God who sees, the Spirit who warns, the covering that intercepts unseen weapons and delivers instructions before the first arrow flies. Shonda Rhimes, award-winning television producer and writer, once said, "Power is not given to you. You have to take it. But you've learned something deeper. Power isn't just taken, it's discerned, protected, and redirected. Your power isn't loud. It's precise. It doesn't fight back. It moves around the blow. And it baffles those who assumed you'd need to be loud to be protected. What if the most dangerous person in the room is the quiet one, already listening to God, somewhere in Melbourne? A woman named Sienna sensed her best friend Sarah's distance shifting into something darker. They hadn't argued. Nothing was said. But Sienna quietly pulled back, cancelled plans, prayed more. 2 weeks later, Sarah admitted she had been planning to publicly embarrass her at an event over a private insecurity. "I don't know how you knew," Sarah confessed. Sienna didn't answer. She just smiled. Some alarms only ring in the soul. That's what unnerves them now. Not just that you responded, but that you responded early, that you avoided a crisis they hadn't yet initiated, that your intuition outran their strategy. You didn't need evidence. You had access. You didn't need to defend yourself. You had distance. You didn't react. You repositioned. That's why their plan failed before it lived. Isaiah 50 promises, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper." But here's what people miss. Sometimes the weapon never finishes forming because your discernment interrupted it mid-construction. What if spiritual radar is your real shield, not just to detect, but to reroute? They're still sitting in silence, wondering how you saw what wasn't shown, how you moved with such eerie accuracy, how the future they were forming never met the present. They don't understand, but you do. Because when you walk with God, you don't need to see the enemy's map to avoid the ambush. Heaven reroutes you before the threat is even drawn. And to those watching, it might look like luck, like instinct, like coincidence. But you know better. It's spiritual interception. And it's how you've stayed one step ahead, not by guessing, but by listening to the one who sees it all. Number 11, you listened to what their eyes were screaming. They thought the performance was flawless. They polished their words, timed their laughs, and adjusted their tone just enough to sound sincere. But their eyes didn't get the memo. They spoke a different language, one that you, the chosen one, were fluent in. The body tried to lie, but the spirit couldn't hold the mask. Every flicker of discomfort, every darting glance, every subtle tension in the jaw, it was all there, a confession dressed in silence. What happens when a person realizes their eyes told the truth their mouth refused to say? You weren't locked in on their speech. You were tuned into something deeper. You read the hesitation before the compliment, the nervous breath before a question that seemed too innocent. You saw how their pupils dilated when you mentioned purpose, how their smiles stiffened when you spoke of peace. They thought they could control the conversation, but they forgot you don't just hear, you discern. You weren't just listening to words, you were decoding frequencies, mapping contradictions, and collecting spiritual data with every blink and pause. You weren't eavesdropping on their secrets. Their own presence was testifying, and you took notes with your spirit, not to expose them, but because truth echoes too loud for your discernment to ignore. What if your spirit could read body language the same way prophets read dreams? Their eyes, though, those were the loudest. You saw the flickers of hidden envy, the glints of quiet guilt, the subtle flares of unresolved resentment. It wasn't dramatic, it was divine, a soft knowing, an internal highlighter that illuminated what others miss. And you didn't flinch. You stayed grounded. You let them speak. You let their soul unravel itself through glances and twitches and poorly timed smiles. and they have no idea how much they revealed. Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That's what you saw in them, the unconscious becoming visible, their shadow showing through their gestures. And your clarity, it didn't come from confrontation, it came from calibration. They're unnerved now, not because you attacked them, but because you didn't need to. You were quiet. You didn't interrupt. You simply received. You let their performance continue, while your discernment quietly underlined every contradiction. That's what has them double-checking every word now, wondering how much they accidentally revealed. They can't stop thinking about your silence, your eyes, your stillness, because it didn't feel passive, it felt like presence. Proverbs 20:27 says, "The human spirit is the lamp of the Lord that sheds light on one's inmost being." That's what they encountered, God's lamp in your stillness. You didn't look at them, you looked through them, and the things they tried to bury were suddenly closer to the surface than they intended. What if every glance was a paragraph in a spiritual testimony they didn't know they were giving? Now they walk away from your conversations unsettled. They try to replay what they said, how they said it, and whether they gave anything away. But they can't pinpoint it, because the truth is, they never said it. Their energy did. Their eyes confessed before their ego could intervene, and you caught it all. Pope Benedict XVI, a theologian and spiritual leader, once wrote, "Seeing with the eyes of Christ, I can give to others much more than their outward necessities. I can give them the look of love which they crave." You didn't judge them, you didn't shame them, you simply saw them fully, and in that sight, there was a mirror they didn't know they were standing in front of, somewhere in Toronto. A man named Eli sat across from a woman named Naomi during a casual brunch. She smiled, laughed, even complimented his latest project, but something felt off. He didn't know why, until he noticed how her eyes darted to the side every time he mentioned growth. Later, it came out. She had been quietly undermining him to mutual friends. He never confronted her. He just realigned the connection. That was enough. The mirror had spoken. You didn't need to ask questions. You didn't pry. You weren't invasive. You simply saw. And when a chosen one sees through without having to see in, it shakes the room, because now they're wondering, how much do you know? How long have you known it? Have you already drawn a conclusion? Are you just waiting for them to admit what you've already seen? John 1:47 says of Jesus, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." And Nathanael, shocked, asks, "How do you know me?" That's how it felt to them. Not like exposure, but like recognition. You weren't interrogating. You were illuminating. You weren't searching. You were simply tuned in. What if the scariest thing about you is that you never asked, and yet still knew? Now, every future interaction feels like a self-inventory. They're not afraid of being wrong. They're afraid of being seen. Spiritually, vulnerably, undeniably seen, because the illusion only works when no one's watching. But you are. And not just with eyes, but with the sight that reads what people try to hide. You didn't do it to catch them. You did it because your gift can't unsee truth when it stands in front of you dressed in performance. They offered a story, but their spirit gave a confession. And you simply took notes. Number 12, you made them realize that hiding from you means hiding from God. They thought this was ordinary, a conversation, a test, A way to gauge if you were really as insightful as people claimed. They didn't know they were stepping into a spiritual diagnostic scan. You weren't analyzing them, you were receiving them. You didn't dig. You discerned. And that alone flipped the balance of power. They stood in front of you, thinking they were in control. But their energy told the story before their words even had the chance. And that's when it hit them. This wasn't just a human moment. This was holy ground. You didn't accuse. You didn't confront. But your knowing unsettled something ancient in them. It was the kind of clarity that bypasses the mind and goes straight to the conscience. Your presence didn't feel like a question. It felt like a verdict. They weren't expecting to feel spiritually measured. They thought they could perform. But your spirit doesn't attend performances. It identifies frequency, and theirs was off. What happens when someone realizes your presence carries the weight of divine clarity? It wasn't about catching them in a lie. It was about standing near someone who could hear what heaven hears. And that's what terrified them. Because you didn't just sense guilt. You sensed origin. You knew what the wound was before they tried to cover it. You didn't say much. But what you didn't say echoed louder than what they rehearsed. Hebrews 4:13 says, "Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of Him to whom we must give account." You didn't need to remind them of that verse. You lived it. And when you looked at them, they didn't just feel observed, they felt revealed. They didn't just feel exposed, they felt accountable. But not to you, to something bigger, watching through you. What if discernment is heaven's way of saying, "I see you even when you think you're safe"? Jordan Peterson, Canadian psychologist and influential speaker, once said, "When you tell the truth, you have reality on your side." That's what unnerved them. They could feel that reality was on your side. Not just truth in facts, but truth in spirit. Your presence validated their conscience. And when someone is not living in truth, that kind of presence is more terrifying than judgment. They cracked not loudly, but inwardly. Their sarcasm didn't land like before. Their charm slipped. Their rehearsed monologues felt empty. They weren't just lying to you, they were lying to themselves. And your presence broke the echo chamber. You didn't accuse them. You let them hear their own voice in a room that no longer protected their illusion. In Detroit, a woman named Ayanna was known for her leadership in local politics, eloquent, respected, and always in control. She invited a young prophetic counselor named Isaiah to speak on emotional intelligence in leadership. But when Isaiah spoke, he didn't just talk about EQ. He suddenly mentioned the exact year Ayanna had contemplated suicide in silence, something not even her mother knew. His voice didn't tremble. His tone wasn't dramatic. But the truth hit her chest like a wave. Ayanna excused herself mid-event and cried for the first time in 7 years. Not because she felt exposed, because she felt seen. It didn't feel like a man talking. It felt like mercy interrupting her self-deception. What if someone sees the part of you that even your prayers avoid? That's what happened when they stood near you. You didn't come to interrogate, but your spirit carried truth. Not to shame, but to awaken. John 3:20 says, "Everyone who does evil hates the light, and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed." They weren't afraid of you. They were afraid of what your presence said about them. Because when light enters the room, hiding becomes uncomfortable, and masks start to itch. Now every interaction with you feels like spiritual recalibration. They measure their words. They self-edit mid-sentence. They shift topics to feel less exposed, not because you demanded truth, but because truth is magnetized to your presence, and their shadow can't survive in your light. What if your quiet conviction is the loudest sermon they've ever heard. You didn't preach. You didn't push. You just carried divine contrast. And the more they see themselves through your stillness, the more they question the story they've been telling themselves. It's not that you revealed them to the world. You revealed them to themselves. And there's no hiding from a reflection that's honest. You don't just recognize patterns, you recognize roots. And when the root is seen, the fruit cannot lie. That's why they're unsettled. Because you made them realize they weren't just hiding from you. They were hiding from God. And God found them anyway through you. Number 13, you made them realize they can't unplug from a connection you never asked for. You never chased them. You never begged for their attention. Never asked to sit in the sacred spaces of their soul. Yet something spiritual ignited the moment they crossed your path. It wasn't chemistry. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't even logical. It was alignment pure, unexpected, and deeply unsettling. Because while they were still trying to figure out what room they'd just walked into, their spirit had already recognized yours. And from that moment on, even without speaking, you became a mirror their soul couldn't look away from. Have you ever felt someone's energy shift without them saying a word? You didn't need updates to know what they were going through. You could feel it. When their energy dipped, your discernment surged. When they masked their pain with performance, your spirit registered the trembling beneath the act. They may have smiled in front of others, but something inside you knew they were unraveling privately. And what disturbed them most? You never asked for this connection. You never manipulated it. But your presence somehow continued to read the frequencies they tried to mute. What if your spirit picks up signals even silence can't block? They started pulling back, avoiding you, not out of hatred, but out of vulnerability. You weren't judging them. You weren't even speaking about what you sensed. But the mere fact that you could sense it at all unnerved them, the same way Elijah knew what was happening in distant war rooms without ever stepping foot in them. 2 Kings 6:12. You knew things that had not been said. They couldn't understand how you knew just that you did, and that truth stalked them quietly in the wilderness. Moses didn't ask for the burden of spiritual sight, yet once God opened his eyes, he could no longer unsee what others missed. He saw rebellion before it took root, idolatry before it turned golden. And like Moses, you've been given spiritual reception not to condemn, but to carry. You didn't seek out their secrets. But when they stood before you, heaven gave you clarity because you could be trusted not to exploit it. What happens when someone realizes they've been read without permission and loved anyway? Florence Welch, the lead singer of Florence Plus the Machine, once admitted, "I was running away from myself, and then I realized my music had been chasing me the whole time." That's the same realization they're having now. They tried to escape you. But what haunts them isn't your gaze, it's the truth you represent. They see you and feel their conscience stirring, not because you say anything, but because your alignment amplifies their internal dissonance. They've muted your number, dodged your presence, unfollowed your life, but the connection still buzzes under their skin. Not obsession awakening, not possession, prophetic resonance, because spiritual alignment doesn't dissolve with distance. It's not tethered to platforms or proximity. You're not watching them. Their soul is still echoing around you, trying to make peace with a connection they can't dismantle. In a quiet coastal town, a man named Cale ran a trauma recovery group. One of the members, Talitha, always remained distant, but one day, Kyle looked at her without a word and said, "Your silence is louder than your screams." Talitha burst into tears. not because he invaded her privacy, but because she had prayed that morning for God to send someone who could see her without her explaining. That sentence healed more than therapy ever could. And she never avoided Cale again, not because she understood him, but because she finally felt understood. Can someone run from being known when all their soul wants is to be seen? Romans 8:27 says, "He who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit." That's what's happening through you. Your knowing doesn't violate them. It invites them. It doesn't spy. It redeems. But they're not used to that. They're used to people who weaponize information, not steward it. And so they don't know what to do with someone who knows too much and yet doesn't use it to their advantage. Like how whales can sense seismic shifts deep beneath the ocean floor. You can feel their spiritual earthquakes long before they make it to the surface. And like the way trees turn their leaves just before a storm, your soul adjusts before any visible sign appears. Nature has always reflected the unseen, and your discernment works the same way: quiet, invisible, prophetic. What if heaven connects you to people not for conversation, but for conviction? They can change their location, block your contact, dismiss your insight. But the connection was never natural to begin with. It was spiritual, formed by alignment, sealed by insight, and sustained by trust from the realm they don't fully understand. That's why it terrifies them, because if you could feel what you feel without being told, what else might you already know? You don't use your gift to control. You use it to carry. You don't use your knowing to expose. You use it to intercede. And that alone places a weight on your presence that their walls can't stand against. You became the spiritual echo they didn't ask for but now can't unhear. What if the connection wasn't for you to manage but for heaven to use? You're not haunting them. You're reminding them of something sacred. That someone once saw them clearly. That someone once heard what they didn't say. That someone once felt the tremors of their unspoken confession and didn't run. And that memory will follow them until they stop hiding, not just from you, but from the truth itself. Number 14. They wanted proof you were chosen. Now they're begging the universe to unchoose them. They didn't come to listen. They came to test. Their ego entered the room before their spirit did, puffed up with pride, ready to pick apart your presence like a science project. They didn't come seeking truth. They came hunting for flaws. They weren't content with questioning your gift. They dared it, not with curiosity, but with contempt. Their posture said it all. Prove it, as if your anointing was a performance, as if heaven's endorsement required their applause. They wanted proof, and they got it, but not the kind that fit their script. Can someone truly measure the chosen by the tools of the unchosen? What they didn't expect was how divine authority doesn't yell. It rests. It doesn't flex. It flows. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't fight for validation. You just stood in a clarity they couldn't replicate. Your presence, unshaken and precise, became the very sign they asked for. And when you spoke, it wasn't loud, it was lightning. A single sentence that cracked open the illusion they'd been living in. One truth, wrapped in calmness, pierced deeper than any argument ever could. Now their confidence has curdled into confusion. Their challenge has backfired. The more they try to dismiss you, the more convicted they feel. Because when someone dares a divine calling, they don't just provoke a person, they brush up against the source who gave the calling. Like when Korah and his followers challenged Moses in the wilderness, mocking his authority and questioning his chosen status, Numbers 16. They thought they were challenging a man, but they were standing in front of an office heaven had ordained, and heaven responded not with argument, but with a shaking that could not be ignored. What if the confrontation they launched was never about you, but about the one who sent you? You didn't retaliate. You didn't need to, just like Jesus. When questioned by the Pharisees, responded with questions that dismantled their accusations without breaking a sweat. Luke 20:3-8. You let your discernment do the talking. You let their own spirit trip over the truth. And now, every time they replay what you said, it haunts them, not because you tried to hurt them, but because you uncovered something their pride had been hiding from for years. Brené Brown, a renowned research professor and speaker known for her work on vulnerability, once said, "You either walk inside your story and own it, or you stand outside your story and hustle for your worthiness." That's what they were doing, hustling, posturing, debating, deflecting. But when they stood before you, all the armor cracked. You didn't ask to strip them of their ego. You simply reflected truth. And truth does not flatter illusions. Have you ever seen someone mock a mirror, only to break under their own reflection? They're losing sleep now, not because you cursed them, but because the weight of what you knew still echoes. You weren't guessing. You weren't speculating. You saw, and that terrifies them. Their smirk has faded. Their sarcasm has turned to silence. Their boldness has been replaced by backpedaling, all while trying not to admit they were wrong. They thought they were evaluating you, but they were the ones being read. And what they felt wasn't just discernment, it was divine response. Psalm 105:15 reminds us, "Touch not my anointed, and do my prophets no harm." This wasn't just a disagreement, it was a violation of spiritual boundary. Heaven doesn't sit idle while the chosen are dishonored. The moment they scoffed, they activated a chain reaction. Doors began closing. Their plans grew restless, and their inner world began collapsing under the weight of conviction they couldn't trace. Can pride survive in the presence of a truth it can't bend? They now fear the very presence they once mocked, not because you're powerful, but because they sense the one who moves through you. They feel watched not by you, but by a righteousness that keeps record, by a justice that sees all. Their requests have shifted from "prove you're real" to "let this stop." But it's not punishment, it's pruning. Heaven isn't trying to destroy them, it's trying to humble them. And humility always comes wrapped in discomfort. In a quiet New England town, a young lawyer named Ezra thought he'd corner his new client, a young woman named Noah, who claimed to have intuitive insight during their meeting. He smugly asked loaded questions, hoping to catch her in contradiction. Noah didn't flinch. She simply looked him in the eye and whispered, "You stopped believing in justice the day your father was buried, and no one came." Ezra froze. No one knew that, not even his closest friend. He left the meeting rattled. Not because she knew, but because she didn't use it against him. He couldn't stop thinking about it for weeks. That one sentence collapsed. Years of bitterness. He thought he'd buried beneath logic. What if the truth they mocked was the truth they secretly needed? Just as Joseph stood before his brothers in Egypt, no longer the boy they betrayed, but a vessel of providence. Genesis 45. You now stand in front of people who once doubted your purpose. You didn't choose to be the one they'd fear, but heaven chose to place authority on your shoulders. And now that anointing unsettles them more than confrontation ever could. You are not their judge, but your presence judges everything fake they try to uphold. And now, just like a deer caught in headlights, they are paralyzed. They don't want your fire anymore. They want quiet, distance, a spiritual reset that allows them to retreat without confessing they were wrong. But even their withdrawal screams the truth. They felt something in you that no ego could explain away. Does spiritual clarity always come with resistance from those who aren't ready? like an eagle soaring in silence, while smaller birds panic below. Your stillness caused their fear to scream louder than any of your words, and like lightning that flashes far before the thunder, your presence warned them, long before the storm reached them. They knew. Deep down, something sacred passed through you, and now that awareness will not let them rest. You didn't demand their belief. You didn't fight for their respect. You simply stood as what you were created to be, a revelation in motion, a mirror not of ego, but of eternity, and they'll never see you the same again. Chosen one. Now the truth stands in full light. They weren't afraid of your voice. They were afraid of what your presence unveiled. You didn't force anyone into confrontation. You didn't chase clarity. You simply walked into the room carrying divine sight. And everything false started trembling. What terrified them wasn't loud revelation. It was quiet recognition. You didn't expose them out of pride. You revealed them by existing in alignment, and when your spirit mirrored what they tried to bury, they realized they were no longer safe behind the mask. This was never about performance. It was never about winning arguments. This has always been about remaining faithful to your assignment. Even when misunderstood, you didn't try to prove you were chosen. You just kept showing up in the fullness of who God called you to be. Every moment they tried to question you, heaven whispered again, "This one is mine." Every time they scoffed at your insight, they were undone by the very truths they pretended not to feel. You weren't trying to scare them. You were sent to awaken what they tried to silence in themselves. So now, what do? You protect your peace like sacred ground. You don't water yourself down just to stay digestible. You honor your discernment and never again second-guess the gift. You stop explaining what was always spiritual to people who only speak in logic. You remember that the discomfort your presence causes is not your burden to carry. It's often their invitation to grow. If only they were brave enough to accept it. Because this was never just about intuition. It was about alignment. It was about the sacred assignment placed on your life. It was about walking with clarity, humility, and authority, without the need to shout, to prove, or to seek validation. You are not here to convince the blind. You are here to walk in light, and your light, chosen one, reveals everything. If this word stirred something in your spirit, let it stay with you. If it echoed what you've quietly known but never had language for, let that confirmation anchor you. And if you've found refuge, revelation, or resonance in this space, I welcome your support. Like this message, share it with those walking a similar path. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Subscribe to continue growing with this community. And turn on notifications so the next time heaven speaks, you don't miss it. And if you feel led to give through super thanks, know that every seed sown helps this message reach those whose souls are silently searching. But whether you give or not, thank you. Thank you for your time, your trust, your presence. May the God who whispers in quiet places continue to thunder in your discernment. May your gift grow sharper. May your peace stay guarded. And may you remember, always, that being chosen is not about proving anything to them. It's about being faithful to the one who called you. You were never on trial. You were always the revelation. Walk in that, and may heaven honor every silent yes you've ever given.